A goldfish has the attention span of 9 seconds. A study done between the year 2000 and 2015 showed the human average attention span had dropped from 12 seconds to a pathetic 8.25 seconds. In 2022, it sits at a mere 8 seconds. And what does this mean for cutscenes in video games? Let's take a dive. To establish our case here, I'll briefly touch on what cutscenes are for any granddads and grandmas in the audience who might be lost already. Cutscenes are segments of non-interactive storytelling in video games, usually in the style of little movies, with dramatic camera angles and cuts to better focus on focal points, facial expressions, that kind of thing. But as many game enthusiasts will know, cutscenes means cutting away from gameplay, where your eyes, ears and hands are held hostage while the developers forcefully direct your focus. Sometimes it's cool and sometimes it's cringe, but either way you're sitting there with a controller in your hands, not hitting any buttons, just waiting to be set free again to continue, actually playing. In some form, cutscenes have been in games since the 80s. Developers experimented more and more with ideas in which to convey their stories to the player, to tuck you into a lovely narrative blanket within the confines of the hardware at the time. These experiments eventually bloomed in the 90s as mainstream video game hardware improved to the point where it was possible to use the graphic engines of the games themselves to generate these cutscenes, with inspiration clearly taken from popular cinematography of movies and television shows of their eras. Huh? Well, that was weird. I'm sorry, where was I? Ah yes, so using these real-time cutscenes, we were treated to some blockbuster titles such as The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hill, the list goes on, but all of these examples were of a time where everything was new to the player. We didn't have the high expectations we do today, and so were blown away time and time again. But while Father Time did his one and only job, games improved dramatically, both visually and mechanically throughout the noughties. But the idea of cutscenes largely stayed the same. Cutscenes have even created their own tropes in our games, such as the cutscene boss. How many times would you get all geared up to take on a boss, but the game would instead have the fight come down to just a cutscene? This was done for a number of reasons, but notably by removing the need for player skill, the battle could play out in a predetermined fashion, often displaying impressive choreography which wouldn't be possible in an actual in-game battle. To circumvent this deflating and anticlimactic eventuality, the use of QTEs or QuickTime events would be used, such as mash X button to strike or press Y to dodge, both of which are underwhelming, and the latter only really sat well with players in Resident Evil 4, though both are definitely an illusion of player input. The fatigue had started to set in.
Interactive moment. Do you know the first game to feature a cutscene? Let me hear your guesses in the comments.
And oi, don't just open another Chrome tab and cheat. Use your own personal guesses, please. There wasn't without exceptions to this monotony of cutscene usage, though. There was a little game series created by Valve called Half-Life, which broke the mold of what it meant to tell a story in a game without taking you out of your gameplay, using visual narrative to create one of gaming's most iconic opening scenes. The tone and story was being shown to you instead of being told to you. This technique is harder to master because allowing the player to retain agency to look freely wherever they like during a story beat means they may be zoning out on a cool poster they discovered on a wall with their backs facing what the game actually wants them to look at. The original Dead Space also made use of visual narrative too, among others, and when done correctly, the player is engaged and feels as though they are organically discovering what is happening around them without having the metaphorical spoon shoved in their mouths. All too often though, video games need to get a lot off their chests early doors, and as a result you get extremely wordy and lengthy and girthy cinematics which would dump a whole lot of jargon at you at once to desperately try and set up the foundations of their story. Let's use Death Stranding as a very recent example, with a whopping 7 hours of cutscene content which consist of frivolously reeling off nonsensical jargon to you in such a cavalier fashion it almost makes you feel stupid for not knowing what the hell anyone is talking about half the time. But a recent game that succeeded both by critics and players alike, Elden Ring. Love it or hate it, Elden Ring surely sets a new standard for what it means to respect the player's skill and perception. Elden Ring succeeds in many ways, but what I'm interested in by referencing it here was the distinct lack of cutscenes. Most of the dialogue in the game, albeit cryptic and needlessly confusing at times, is optional. You can walk away at any time. You can learn about the story at your own will, or you can just ignore it and be invested in an engaging open world with insane amounts of content to discover without being constantly pulled out of the gameplay by cutscenes. The boss battles aren't interrupted by cutscenes either. Every strike is your doing. The focus is on how the player chooses to build their character, learning bosses' attack strings to time perfect dodges, or discover their weaknesses and exploit them with the gear and weapons that you discover. And when there are cutscenes, they are welcome because the game chooses quality over quantity, and you know something big is going down if they need to cut you from the gameplay briefly to see it. Now, not every game should be like Elden Ring, and not every game needs to be like Elden Ring, but it's certainly generated some interesting conversation to modern, popular mainstream video game design for sure. This brings me to the mentality shift of the player and our relationship with dopamine. Dopamine, and I quote,
Dopamine is a neurotransmitter made in your brain. It plays the role as the reward center and in many body functions, including memory, movement, motivation, mood, attention, and more.
End quote. End quote. So it's basically a drug that our body creates itself, and we're all addicted to it in some way, shape or form. We live in the era now of instant gratification, with companies and corporations having already discovered how to leverage our dopamine addictions against us. They've been using little and often rewards to keep us feeling hooked or engaged in a competitive market to hold our attentions the longest. But as these techniques have been used for so long in many mediums, our attention spans have greatly shortened as a result. Remember, on average, a goldfish can focus longer than the average human by a whole second now. Ahem. So to bring this back to cutscenes in video games, have our decreased attention spans had the knock-on effect of decreased tolerance to cinematics in games, regardless of their quality? There are a lot of factors to take into account for sure, the age of the player I believe being a strong one. Now, this is anecdotal, but when I was in my early teens, I had all the time in the world to sit and enjoy cutscenes in games. Outside of school, I would basically just be glued to my games console and would happily sit through cutscene after cutscene in the latest Metal Gear, the Resident Evils and so on, and be completely absorbed by them. But as I've gotten older, with more responsibilities, the time I have to actually play games that way just isn't the same. There's more on my mind, distractions around every corner. I can't fully shut off and enjoy a story game like I used to, and it's sad because I want to have that feeling again, where you're so engrossed in a game that you don't think about anything else while you play it. But I just can't seem to do it. And now I have a large library of games which just sit and gather metaphorical dust. So for me, lengthy and the often obnoxious use of cutscenes switches me off. The time I spend playing a game, I'd like to feel as though I'm actually playing, not watching. Love them or hate them though, it does seem cutscenes are here to stay. But at least there are developers out there breaking down the walls of predictable monotony and still being just as successful. So what do you think about cutscenes? I asked a bunch of people before I started working on this video what their opinions were on cutscenes, and I got a very wide selection of answers. So I just find it really interesting how we all engage differently with our games. So I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you love sitting and watching lots of cutscenes in video games, or are you a little bit like me and you're getting frustrated with the overuse of them? If you have enjoyed this video, guys, please let me know by hitting the thumbs up button for me. Definitely subscribe if you haven't already. And, ooh. What's this? I think it might be a video you might like. Go on, click it. Click it. Look at it. Cool. Look at it. Click it. Click it. Go on, I'll see you when I'm looking at you. Click it. Go on, click it. Click it.